Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 328 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and I'm joined today by Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
This is a special bonus episode that we recorded to thank our patrons at patreon.com/StarQuest for their generosity in making this and all our shows at StarQuest possible. We gave them early exclusive access, but now we're sharing it with you to show you one of the benefits of being a patron. So please enjoy the show. Jimmy, how will we be handling the questions today, and what sort of questions will the patrons be asking?
Well, we're going to be looking at the questions more or less in the order they came in. We'll cover about an hour's worth today, and then any questions we don't get to, we'll save for our next Patrons Question Show. We're going to be talking about things like whether demons can reveal sins you've already confessed, the Taotaomo'na spirits from Guam, George Washington's reported vision of the Virgin Mary, the Order of Melchizedek, religious figures in near-death experiences, and more.
Very good. So let's get right to those questions. The first question comes from Ryan, who asks, I was told by our pastor that demons are not able to mention the sins of those in the room during an exorcism, provided those sins were confessed and absolved. So the seal of confession also applies to demons. Your thoughts?
My first thought is I'd be skeptical of this claim. I don't see what motivation a demon would have to observe the seal of confession. The only reason for it would be if God put a limit on demons, prevented them from doing this, and the seal of confession is not essential to the sacrament. In the early church, confession was often practiced publicly, and the seal of confession is a prudential measure that the church adopted when it was discovered that people would be much more willing to confess if you give them an absolute assurance of confidentiality. So since God didn't require the seal to be part of the sacrament, I don't know why he would require demons to observe it. However, it would be very interesting to survey a bunch of highly experienced exorcists and see if demons ever blurt out things like this in exorcisms. If they do, it would falsify the claim, but if they don't, then that would be evidence favoring the claim, though we'd still need to look at other possible alternative explanations, like whether the demons just aren't focused on that kind of thing. So there might be other reasons why they don't do it besides being forbidden to do it. What would not settle the question for me is demons claiming that they can't do it, because you should never believe anything a demon says for any reason.
Very good. So our next question comes from Nick, and he asks, has Jimmy done any research into the folk beliefs of the Pacific Islanders? In Guam, for example, there are the Taotaomo'na. The apostrophe is a glottal stop there, so it Taotaomo'na.
Although it's not always pronounced. I checked some videos.
So I'll do my best. They're believed to be spirits which will pinch people, leaving bruises. Does Jimmy think that these could be demonic or something else?
I've done some looking into the Taotaomo'na. There are several different kinds of them, and they're understood in different ways. Some are believed to be the ghosts of ancestors. Others are believed to be non-human spirits. Of course, there are always natural explanations that have to be considered for any paranormal report. But if we set aside natural explanations and just say, suppose these are spirits, well, presumably they'd be the same types of spirits that people are familiar with in the West. We just call them by different names. So the spirits of ancestors would be ghosts. Non-human spirits would be angels or demons. And while it's possible that there are other kinds of non-human spirits, those haven't been revealed to us. And we tend to use the term angel or demon for any created non-human spirit.
Very good.
We'll also have some links, by the way, to where you can learn more about the Taotaomo'na.
Next comes Dan, who asks, the demons seem to have a much greater physical and mental reaction to God than the rich man asking a drink from Abraham. Will the rich man become demonic at the final judgment?
There are some elements in Judeo-Christian tradition that have a permeable boundary between humans and angels and demons. However, the way the church's current vocabulary is used, the term angel and demon refer to fundamentally non-human creatures. Therefore, using vocabulary in this way, humans never become angels or demons, and vice versa. Therefore, damned souls like the rich man from Jesus' parable would not become demons in the proper sense of the term. However, they may still be classified as evil spirits, and someone could refer to them as demonic in a looser or improper sense of the term.
Next comes a question from Ryan, who asks, Jimmy, have you heard of George Washington's alleged vision of the Virgin Mary? I'd like your opinion on it. Possible future episode?
Sure, I have heard about it. In fact, I remember reading about it when I was a kid in a UFO magazine of all places. In this vision, George Washington allegedly saw a series of major wars that would confront the United States. The first was the Revolutionary War, the second was the Civil War, and the third was a massive invasion of the United States by nations from Europe, Asia, and Africa. The trouble is that the first-hand account of this vision was given in 1859 by an old soldier named Anthony Sherman, who gave it to a writer named Wesley Bradshaw, who then published it. The account was taken from the reprint of the U.S. war veterans paper, the National Tribune, in December 1880. And that newspaper, by the way, is now called Stars and Stripes. According to the published account, Anthony Sherman said, let's go into the hall, and I want to tell you of an incident in Washington's life, one which no one alive knows of except myself. So, well, George Washington died in 1799, so the first account of this is 60 years later. And it comes from this one guy. He says, no one alive knows about this except me. So given that George Washington was famous as America's founding president, and given the kind of cinematic nature of the vision and how it reflects two things that had already happened and really only includes prophetic material for a third, and it ends up glorifying America and stuff, I think it's much more likely that this account is a hoax, that it's made up.
Right. Ryan had a second question. He asks, are you familiar with the Sicilian tradition of St. Joseph's altar? I am, being Sicilian. If not, it's a memorial celebration of when St. Joseph allegedly intervened during a famine in Sicily. People make an altar and stack various items on it, such as food, candy, pictures, statues, etc., and a priest blesses the altar. A non-Catholic friend saw images of one such event and said it looked like a Catholic mass being offered up to St. Joseph, so idolatry. And yes, it does look very similar to what happens in Mass where we offer up these gifts to St. Joseph. Can you comment on this practice, please?
Well, one of the things that's interesting about it is not listed in the 2001 Directory for Popular Piety, which was a document that was put out by the Congregation, I believe, for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments. Yeah, in 2001. And since it's not listed there, that would indicate this is a local tradition. It's not one that really has a global reach. In terms of, is it idolatry? Well, idolatry can be understood either in terms of exterior behavior or interior behavior. The problem is there is no specific exterior act that constitutes idolatry. I mean, like, for example, here we have putting food on a table. Yeah, but if you go to a restaurant and someone puts food on a table in front of you, they're not committing idolatry. They're not worshiping you as a god. Similarly, there are other symbolic gestures of respect that people do to each other that just don't constitute regarding that person as a god. Now, in some contexts, they may signify, an external act may signify that you think someone is a god, but true idolatry is of the heart and consists of, thinking that a creature is divine when it's not. So I understand why your friend, who is using an exterior definition of idolatry, could regard it as such, but from an interior, the essence of idolatry is interior and not exterior. And so the matter can't be judged by just looking at someone's external behavior. You have to ask them, do you think St. Joseph is a deity? And if they say no, then he's a finite creature like I am, which is what I assume these Sicilians would say, then they're not committing idolatry. They're just doing a show of respect.
All right. Dan asks the next question. The order of Melchizedek seems to just appear without a clear lineage, as we see in the Aaronic, Levitical, or the current apostolic lineage. Why is the order of Melchizedek established, and why do we not see from generation to generation this handed down? Lastly, could the Antichrist come claiming he is in the order of Melchizedek?
Okay, so Melchizedek was the Jebusite king of Jerusalem in Genesis 14. He was also, we're told there, priest of God Most High, or El Elyon, to use the Hebrew name that's used there. Psalm 110, which is a royal psalm about the king of Israel, looks back on this event and says, depending on how you translate it, you are to the king, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. But this name is anachronistic, and actually Melchizedek may not have used it because kings had multiple names and the names could change over time. Essentially, what Melchizedek means is righteous king. And kings would sometimes take throne names like, oh, I'm going to be a righteous king, so I'm going to call myself righteous king. The psalm applies this term to the Jewish king, but it may not be envisioning Melchizedek from Genesis, because you could also translate it, you are a priest forever, a righteous king by my decree, or a rightful king by my decree, which is actually how the Jewish Publication Society translation renders it. But whatever the original order that Melchizedek belonged to would have covered or been called, it likely ended no later than the time that David conquered Jerusalem and made it his capital. This is why that priesthood is no longer handed down. However, Christ spiritually fulfilled it according to the author of Hebrews. So there are certain similarities between Christ and Melchizedek, and the author of Hebrews explores some of those. When it comes to the Antichrist, well, he can claim whatever he likes. However, I don't think that the Antichrist is likely to be understood as someone who imitates Christ, but as someone who considers Christ an enemy. In fact, the way the term Antichrist is used in St. John's epistles, which is the only place it appears in the New Testament, it's referring to someone who denies the incarnation of Christ. So it's not someone who's impersonating Christ or claiming to be like Christ in the sense of I'm the Jewish Messiah. It's someone who denies the incarnation altogether, and thus likely is a pagan origin.
Right. Our next question comes from Ray. It says, hi, Jimmy. I may be mistaken, but I think I heard you say that some people saw Muhammad or other religious figures in their near-death experience or other related visions. How should we harmonize these claims with the truth of Christianity? Can some visions support some religions to be as true as Christianity? Thanks for the great show. As an adult fan, I'm looking forward to true crime mysteries. I love suspense.
Well, thank you. And we will have more true crime episodes in the future. In fact, the next 2 weeks, we're going to be looking at the Zodiac Killer. You do often hear claims about seeing non-Christian religious figures in near-death experiences, like Muhammad or Buddha or whatever. But when you actually study the matter, reports of Muhammad and other non-Christian religious figures in near-death experiences appear to be rare. They appear to be outlier cases that may not be accurate or may just be based on someone's perception. If you'd like to read about that, there's a book by J. Steve Miller called Is Christianity Compatible with Deathbed and Near-Death Experiences? And he did his own research into this, and he found that people overwhelmingly see God and they overwhelmingly see Jesus, even if they're not Christian, but they only very, very seldomly report seeing anybody else.
The next question comes from Stephanie Ann, who writes, "Hi, Jimmy and Dom. My daughter is in Life Teen, and her teacher told her that if everyone on earth prayed the rosary at the same time, the devil would die. So her question is, if the devil died, would hell disappear? What would happen to the damned souls? Thanks. Love the show."
Well, I don't know what the Life Teen teacher meant. The devil is an immortal spiritual being and cannot literally die. So it's not true that if everyone on earth prayed the rosary, the devil would die, because he's an immortal. He doesn't have a physical body, and so his physical body can't stop functioning. On the other hand, if the devil ceased to exist, if God just annihilated him, that wouldn't undo all the damage he did in history. It would not rewrite history. Therefore, hell would not disappear, and any souls that had been lost would not cease to be lost. They would simply continue on experiencing what they had chosen, which was separation from God. It's important to note that hell is not a creation of the devil. Hell is, the way it's depicted in the Bible, it's a creation of God as a place for the devil and his angels to go. They don't run it. They experience suffering themselves there. And, in terms of what does this imagery mean? Well, it means that, this is a way of picturing the fate of those who choose to live without God for eternity. And that includes the devil and his angels, but it also includes humans who would choose to live without God for eternity. And if you just deleted the devil from existence, that wouldn't stop other people from choosing to live without God for eternity, as regrettable as that choice is.
And the next question comes from Super Bro Prime, who asks, "I'm interested in seeing your perspective on whether or not using credit card rewards can be considered profiting from usury, as credit providers are able to provide them largely based on profits made from users who pay interest and fees levied by the credit providers."
Well, personally, I never use credit card rewards, but that's just because of laziness. I also pay for basically everything with a debit card because when I was young, I had some early bad experiences with credit, and I decided I'm going to live within my means. I'm going to pay cash for everything. So I use a debit card. I paid off all my credit, and now I only have credit in case of an emergency. Having said that, using credit card rewards is simply using one benefit that you've contracted for. It's no different than the other benefits of using a credit card. Taking interest is not intrinsically immoral, as the church has recognized since the Middle Ages. Borrowing and lending is not a zero-sum game where someone wins and somebody else loses, as was thought in antiquity. You gain something by having the use of money right now. And it's reasonable. If you've borrowed money, that means whoever you borrowed it from doesn't have the use of that money right now, but you gain from having the money right now. Like if you use it to invest in a business so you can start making money, and you're preventing the other person who loaned you the money from doing the same thing. So it's only just that you pay him something in exchange for the use of his money, which he didn't have to lend to you, and deny himself the use of the money. What is immoral is taking too much interest, but I don't see a basis for credit card rewards, which are pretty minor, as being based on taking too much interest. You'd have to argue the too much interest on some other grounds.
The next question.
So I wouldn't be scrupulous about this.
Okay. The next question comes from Tristram, who asks, "When God spoke to Moses and to the other saints in the Old Testament, was it God the Father speaking, or Jesus, or the Holy Spirit, or all three persons speaking as one? Thanks."
Theologians hold that all three persons cooperate in every act outside of the Trinity. So they all three cooperate in different ways in creation. They all three cooperate in different ways in redemption, and they all three should cooperate in different ways in revelation. But this wouldn't stop one of them from being the primary speaker. In some cases, like if you read the Old Testament or the New Testament, the primary speaker may be the Holy Spirit, or it may be Jesus. But normally in the Old Testament, it's assumed to be God the Father. That's why Jesus in John's Gospel says, "You believe in God, believe also in me." And so this statement recognizes that the primary object of worship, and thus the primary speaker in the Old Testament, is the Father. And so barring anything else, they all cooperate in some way, but usually in the Old Testament, the primary speaker is the Father, and one should assume it's the Father speaking unless it's flagged with something else, like the Holy Spirit says.
Then the next question from Chris is, "Hey, Jimmy, from a reason perspective, what would you say is the best rebuttal to an atheist who claims that evolution disproves the existence of God? To me, it seems unlikely that a universe with the evolutionary potential for intelligent life could create itself from nothingness. In my question, I'm looking for a rebuttal that seeks harmony with science, not one that opposes it. Thanks."
Yeah, well, many of the pioneers of evolutionary theory were Christian and did not see the two as being in conflict. Darwin himself wrote that it was, in his words, quote, "absurd to doubt that a man might be an ardent theist and an evolutionist," close quote. So Darwin himself didn't see a conflict here, and neither does the church. The Catechism praises modern science for the light that it shed on, quote, "the origin and development of life forms," close quote. Biological evolution does not disprove the existence of God. Biological evolution would simply be the means by which God brought about the life forms we currently have, but it doesn't rule out there being a God, as even most, any sensible evolutionary scientist will agree. It doesn't disprove the existence of God. The potential for God to use tools like biological evolution to bring about life forms has, been recognized throughout Christian history. And if evolution is true, which I think we have good evidence for, it simply identifies one of the tools that God used.
Michelle asks, "Hi, Jimmy. Could we have a deep dive into end-of-life orbs, please? Hours before my husband passed, an orb visited our bedroom as I watched. I even videotaped it on my phone. It seemed curious, going up and down his body. It moved around the room and even checked out the books on a bookshelf. It even went to his mouth at one point, as though checking his breathing. I can't find much on this kind of experience. Can you help? Thanks, Jimmy. I love your shows."
Well, I've done a lot of research on deathbed phenomena, and orbs are not commonly reported as a deathbed phenomenon. Many orbs that have been photographed are actually natural phenomena that, are produced by camera artifacts like motes of dust and reflections and things like that. But I would be very curious to see this video if you still have it. And I would be curious to know if you could, see the orb with your own eyes and not just through the camera. If you saw the orb with your own eyes and that's what led to you taking the video, then that would point to this not just being a camera artifact. And so I'd be very curious to see it. I have heard of this, even though these aren't common. And if I can get a good source of information, then we may well cover it in the future. But feel free to contact us if you're interested in following up on this more. And like I say, I'd love to see this video if that's something you're comfortable with.
The next question comes from Perla, who asks, "Hello, Jimmy. Does the Catholic Church have teaching about pursuing psychic abilities, like learning to do remote viewing, practicing techniques to have out-of-body experiences, like going to the Monroe Institute, practicing telepathy with people live or dead, etc.? I hear that you said the Church has no problem if we study these phenomena for scientific research. My question is if there's teaching about actively pursuing these psychic abilities for personal use. Thank you."
Well, the Church doesn't have a teaching on this question, and in the absence of a teaching or a law, liberty is presumed. There is a question about whether psi functioning exists, but if it does, as a natural human ability, it wouldn't be wrong in principle to use something that God built into human nature. But caution is also warranted. There are teachers out there who are charlatans or who have introduced non-Christian elements into their teaching, out of confusion. So you always have to use critical thinking. But the development and use of psychic abilities is not intrinsically wrong. For example, even exorcists like Father Gabriel Amorth and Monsignor Stephen Rossetti use psychics, who they call sensitives, in exorcism cases.
The next question comes from Steely, who says, "Hey, Jimmy and Dom, thank you for all the fantastic work you do. My question is, does Jimmy think that the United States might have adopted the metric system as its official standard if Joseph Dombey, the man carrying the kilogram standard weight to Thomas Jefferson, had not died after being waylaid by British privateers while crossing the Atlantic?"
Well, I hesitate to predict what would have happened in alternate timelines. But if the question is it possible? And I'd say, sure, it's possible. But there could also be other timelines where Joseph Dombey survived and the U.S. didn't adopt the metric system. Americans, in fact, have shown an unusual resistance to using metric rather than imperial. We just seem to prefer imperial, and every time Americans can be stubborn, and every time that that Congress or other entities have tried to introduce metric, it has failed here in the United States. If you'd like, for listeners who may like more information about the incident that Steely is referring to, we'll have a link in the show notes so that you can find out what happened with the pirates.
Our next question comes from Mary, who asks, "Hello, and thank you for the chance to participate in the subject matter. Could you address twin telepathy? I was specifically thinking of this case," and she provided a link which we'll put in the show notes. Thank you.
So the link is about a pair of twins named Kayla and Kelly Bingham, and they went to pre-med school in South Carolina, and their answers on the test, like one of the tests that they took, were very similar, and they got accused of cheating. And they then sued the university for defamation. They argued, they didn't argue about telepathy in this case, but they pointed out that twins very often have very similar results on tests, and they'd had this going on their whole lives. So the mere fact that their answers were very similar on the test didn't mean that they had been cheating. And they won their case. However, they at that point decided, or by that point had decided, they didn't want to do medicine after all, and so they went into another field. So this legal case was based on a genetic argument rather than a telepathic argument. They didn't say we were in communication via telepathy, which you could actually accuse them for cheating if that was what they had claimed. However, parapsychologists have studied twin telepathy as well as other forms of what are known as bonded pair telepathy. A bonded pair is a pair of people who have an emotional bond. So this could be husband-wife, it could be parent-child, it could be twins, and it has been studied in parapsychology, and we will be covering it in the future.
Tim asks the next question. "Jimmy, do you ever struggle with mental block or self-doubt while writing? If so, how do you overcome it? Or if you don't struggle with those sorts of things, how might someone avoid them? Thanks."
I basically never have writer's block when I write nonfiction. Once I find what I think of as my entry point into the piece, it usually flows very quickly. And I have a reputation for sometimes writing preternaturally fast. Like I'll get a request. I'll get a request from an editor for an article and it's, can you do this? And instead of emailing back a response that says, yes, I can do the article, I'll just take an hour or two and then email them the article itself. If I don't have to stop and do research, I can write more than 1,000 words an hour. There are, though, cases where I procrastinate doing something, but it usually isn't because I'm blocked. If I write fiction, which I very rarely do because I don't really have time for it, then I can get writer's block. But the standard solution, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction, is write something. It doesn't matter if it's bad. Just write something and you can fix it later in the revision stage.
Yes, that's usually my answer to procrastination is just start doing anything, even if it's not related. Just start. Our next question comes from Loretta. Hello, Jimmy. I'm a newbie and love your program, especially your research and detailed investigations. Have you ever researched anything regarding the Bell Witch of Tennessee? I have read several books on the subject, am fascinated by the topic, and would love your opinion on this mystery. Thank you, Loretta.
I am familiar with the Bell Witch case, which was a poltergeist case in Tennessee in the early 1800s. Although I'm familiar with it, I haven't yet researched it in depth, but it is on the big list, and I do plan to cover it in the future.
And I believe that you've mentioned it in previous patrons episodes.
Yeah.
So if you're going back through our catalog, you'll encounter it there as well. Some more on that. Our next question comes from Russell, who writes, May God bless you and Dom. I'm a retired United States sailor. There are many weird traditions and stories in the sea services. Mermaids are well known, but I have one for you. It's the Seabat. This creature has been described in various ways. It is a bat adapted to water survival, such as other mammals. It has also been described as a cross between a bat and a fish, sometimes some adaptation of flying fish species. At times, they've been caught on the ships, trapped inside closed doors. Sometimes they fly into topside structures and are found stunned on the deck. There's yet to be a picture of one. Have you heard of the Seabat?
Well, I have heard of the Seabat. I'm familiar with the Seabat as a Navy tradition that is kind of a naval version of the snipe hunt prank. What I'm aware of is that sometimes when they have newbies on a ship, some of the experienced sailors will have a box upside down on the deck, and they'll be looking at it, and one guy will be there with a broom, like he's going to hit whatever under the box, when they take the box off. And the established sailors will tell the newbies that they've got a Seabat under the box. Really, there's nothing there, but they'll hoax them and prank them, telling them there's about this Seabat. And then at some point, the guy with the broom will reel it back and whack the newbie in the butt. And then they'll reveal there's nothing under the box and reveal the prank. However, to the extent that some Navy men might take this seriously, I'd be a little skeptical for obvious reasons, since it's a known hoax. Though there are creatures like flying fish and manta rays that could serve as a basis for something like the Seabat, and hypothetically, there could be unknown creatures too. I'd be fascinated to see any documentation you could provide, Russell, about a non-prank version of this. And by the way, we'll have a link to a story about the prank version for people who'd like to read more about it.
AJ Beals has probably the most controversial of all the questions next. AJ, thanks for sending this in. Does pineapple belong on pizza? Yes or no?
Well, in the Good Place, it does. Pineapple pizza is the only kind of pizza they have available in the Good Place, if you've ever seen that TV show. I would say de gustibus non est disputandum. There is to be no disputing about tastes. If you want pineapple on your pizza, you can have it. If you don't have to. As
the resident person of Italian heritage, I'm going to offer my take as well, which is, does it belong on pizza? Not more than any other ingredient you put on top, but don't put it on mine.
Yeah. And when you go over to Italy, they put all kinds of weird stuff on pizza. Hot dog pizza, French fry pizza, arugula pizza, which they call rocket in Europe.
Yep. Yeah. They are much less strict about it than we are here in the U.S. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by Great Lakes Customs Law, helping importers and individuals with seizures, penalties, and compliance with U.S. Customs matters throughout the United States. Visit GreatLakesCustomsLaw.com. Our next question comes from Jeff, who says, is there still a mysterious feedback segment? I submitted some a few months ago, but I'm sure there's a huge amount of it to go through.
At this point, there certainly is. I'm afraid that with my move to Arkansas and shifts and getting my new household set up and new duties like teaching at the Rhine, that I got busy and I haven't been able to process the feedback, for which I owe a big apology to Rob Leonardi, our feedback coordinator. I'm currently thinking about what to do and how to handle feedback in the future. And at this point, I'm not certain. I would like to include feedback in the future, but I'm not sure what the best form that could take would be. And right now I'm still kind of in catch-up mode. Before the move, I had 18 scripts in the tank for Mysterious World for 18 episodes, which was a great position to be in, because I could rearrange them based on topics to ensure a kind of good topical mix. But then in the process of moving and getting my new household set up, I burned through those. And so now I'm kind of struggling to keep up with the scripts, and the scripts have to take priority over the feedback. So I'm not sure what's going to happen here, but it is something that we do value the feedback, and I read all of the feedback we get. Just in terms of using it on the show, that's something that I'm not yet sure where we're going to be going with that, but it is something I want to do.
Yeah. I think people would rather have new episodes on new things rather than over feedback. We want both, but we definitely want to prioritize the new episodes. Our next question comes from Jay, who says, have you considered doing an episode just on the Patterson-Gimlin film, a purported Bigfoot film? The guys at Astonishing Legends, which podcast I discovered because of your mention it in the Betsphere episode, so thanks, have a seriously deep dive that went a ways towards convincing me that at least that film and whatever is shown in it isn't a hoax. I'd love to hear your discussion and analysis of the film and the significant amount of research that's been done on it.
Yeah, so this is something I've mentioned a few times. We did Bigfoot back in episode 3 of Mysterious World, and back then I knew a lot less about most of the mysteries we cover than I do now, and I certainly knew less about Bigfoot. And there's some information I relied on in that Bigfoot episode that is sketchy. And so what I want to do is revisit Bigfoot. And one of the things I've thought about doing as part of that revisitation is an episode just on the Patterson-Gimlin film. I've listened to Astonishing Legends deep dive into it. It's a multi-episode thing. If you listen to them all, it's like 11 or 13 hours long just on the Patterson-Gimlin film. I don't plan to do an episode or a group of episodes that long, but it is worth revisiting the film. I also want to revisit a Bigfoot, in other terms, other evidence that there is for Bigfoot. My position has shifted a little bit on Bigfoot. I've always wanted Bigfoot to be real. And the key obstacle that I see to Bigfoot being real is how could a breeding population, assuming Bigfoot is just a normal primate and not some supernatural creature, but how could a breeding population of large primates exist in North America and remain undiscovered to science? And so that's the big obstacle. However, even though I was quite skeptical in episode 3 of Bigfoot being real, I've since done reading, like, for example, Jeff Meldrum's book, Sasquatch, which discusses not only the Patterson-Gimlin film, but other evidences for Bigfoot at length. And I am now more open to the existence of Bigfoot. I still see the big problem. How do we get a breeding population of a larger than human primate in North America that remains undiscovered? But I am aware that there is more evidence than I thought favoring Bigfoot. And so we will do future episodes on Bigfoot, including I'm thinking one on the Patterson-Gimlin film specifically.
I think he stole D.B. Cooper's money and is using it to stay off the grid. So our next question comes from Caroline, who says, "Hi, Jimmy and Dom. Thank you for this amazing podcast. You are my traveling companions every Tuesday as I drive to the Cape Canaveral Lighthouse to volunteer," which, I'll add, is really cool. I have biblical questions. First, in the Old Testament, could Joseph not have visited his family after becoming second only to Pharaoh? I'm sure he would have liked to see his father again, or was he not allowed to leave the Pharaoh's court?
Well, we really don't know the answer to this question. Egyptians did leave Egypt, for example, for military campaigns. And even the Pharaoh left Egypt. It was his job to lead the military. And, they were kind of like the go old. They invade other neighboring peoples, beat them up, and take their stuff and bring it back to Egypt. That was the Pharaoh's job, one of his jobs. However, someone's got to stay back at home running the fort while the Pharaoh's going and doing that. And so Joseph's duties as the vizier of Egypt might have prevented him from leaving, or he may have thought that he wouldn't get a warm welcome if he went home. Like maybe if his brothers saw him coming, they'd kill him. Or he may have thought maybe his father's dead because his father was very old, according to the text. Or maybe he was planning on going and his brothers, because Joseph had to take care of the famine situation in Egypt, and that's what brought his brothers down. So maybe his brothers just ended up coming first, and Joseph was going to wait till the famine is over to go visit the family.
Carolyn's second question: when King David had Uriah killed, his punishment was the death of his son with Bathsheba. This was a very harsh punishment, especially for the innocent child, made even harder when his other son by Bathsheba was Solomon, who became king in his own right. Why do you think it had to be this way?
Well, this is a subcase of what's known as the problem of evil, which is how can there be a good God and we still have evil? And there's been a lot of research done on that. I've given talks on that. This is specifically a subcase of the problem of suffering, which is part of the problem of evil. And if you go to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy Akin, and search on suffering, or if there is a good God, why do I suffer? You'll find a whole talk I did on the general problem. So here, I'm not going to focus so much on the general principles that apply. I'm going to focus more specifically on the text. The biblical authors tend to speak of God as causing physical evil, like the death of the child in this passage. But I tend to interpret things in terms of God allowing evil rather than causing evil. The reason that the biblical authors talk about God causing evil is they want to portray him as a powerful king who's in charge. But that doesn't literally mean that God does every single thing himself. He may just allow some stuff to happen. And we even see examples of that in Scripture. But whichever way you interpret it, whether God actively causes a physical evil, now God never causes moral evil, but physical evil is not itself sinful, it's just suffering. And so whether God causes suffering or merely allows suffering, according to the Catechism, the faith gives us the assurance that God would not allow any evil, or in this case, any suffering, if he wasn't going to bring an equal or greater good out of it. We can speculate then on what that good is, and in some cases, we may be able to come up with a decent answer. In other cases, we're going to have to wait to the afterlife to find out what was the good that God was bringing out of this situation. In the case of David, where his first son by Bathsheba dies, well, one of the things it does is teach David a lesson. He killed Bathsheba's husband. He technically encompassed the death of Bathsheba's husband. But he effectively made it happen. And it's like, okay, you took a life of someone to whom their life was precious. You're going to suffer the same thing. Someone who's precious to you is going to die. Now, so that's a good that came out of it. But then the question becomes, well, what about the child? Well, here's where the Christian worldview comes in, because a lot of people would say, there's no way for God to make it up to the child if the child dies. But from the Christian point of view, that is not true. If the Judeo-Christian view is true and we all have an afterlife, then it's not like God can't make it up to the child in the afterlife. In fact, St. Paul in the New Testament says that the sufferings of this present life, including the suffering of death, are not even worth comparing to the eternal weight of glory that God has in store for us. So no matter what we suffer in this life, including death, which we will all suffer, God will more than make it up to us in the next life, which is eternal. And we'll have the glory of being with him in heaven for eternity. And that infinite good will outweigh any finite evil that we experienced in this life. And so the child in David's case is going to be more than compensated for what happened. And David learns a valuable lesson. And maybe there are some other lessons in there too. But what we can be certain of is God would not allow this to happen or cause it to happen if he wasn't going to bring about an equal or greater good.
Carolyn has a third question from the New Testament. Why do you think that Jesus' betrayer had to be one of the 12 apostles? It seems so heartbreaking to have been one so close to him. He had many other disciples. Could it not been of one of them? Not sure these are very mysterious questions, but have been ones I wondered about. Thanks.
Yeah, well, patrons' questions can be any question the patron wants to ask, so it doesn't have to be mysterious. In terms of this question, I don't think we can ultimately know the answer. The answer may partially depend on Judas's free will, which God incorporated into his plan. God may have allowed this evil, specifically betrayal by one of the 12 rather than by someone else, to teach a lesson on to us today on how evil can get in anywhere, even into Jesus's closest disciples. So we really need to be on guard against it. There also was a tactical advantage to it being Judas rather than someone who was on the periphery of Jesus's circles, because Judas, being a core disciple, knows where Jesus is going to be, and so that can help the authorities fulfill their plan to arrest Jesus privately rather than publicly, because they were concerned if they arrested him publicly, there'd be a riot. And so, so if you have someone who's close to Jesus, only the insiders are going to know where you can go to arrest him secretly. And in fact, the way that Jesus arranges the Last Supper, where he sends 2 disciples into Jerusalem on, the day of Passover to find a place for the Passover meal to be eaten, or, this is the afternoon before, but he's sending them in to find a place for the Passover meal. He doesn't say, go to the house of so-and-so. Instead, he says, go into Jerusalem. You'll see a guy who's carrying a jar of water, which is normally women's work. So this stands out to see a man carrying a jar of water. Follow him home. And wherever he goes in, you go in too, and say to the house owner, where is the prepared upper room for Jesus to celebrate the Passover? So Jesus had already arranged with somebody, maybe the previous Passover, to have a room available for him to celebrate this Passover. But instead of just telling the disciples, and specifically it's Peter and John, we learned in Luke, instead of telling them just go to this guy's house, he has this elaborate charade to help him find the house. And why would there be this elaborate charade? Well, for my money, and according to other scholars, the reason is to keep Judas from knowing where he's going to be for the Last Supper. Because if Jesus just said to the disciples, go to Bob's house, Judas can go immediately to the authorities and say, Jesus is going to be eating Passover at Bob's house. You can go there to arrest him. And then the authorities descend on the Passover meal and Jesus doesn't get to eat it. But he really wants to eat this Passover. He's going to institute the Lord's Supper. And so what he does is he keeps the location of the Last Supper secret until the very last minute. So not even Judas knows where it's going to be until the last minute. And that way Judas can't vamoose until the middle of the meal. And by that point, they're going to finish it. And Judas knows he's going to be in the Garden of Gethsemane. And that's why he gets arrested there. But this way, Jesus gets to eat the Passover and make his final speeches to the disciples and institute the Eucharist. Whereas if he hadn't used this rigmarole, then he wouldn't have gotten to do all this. So it looks like that Judas, being an insider, has an advantage over someone who is more on Jesus's periphery.
Everyone's got that one friend in the group who you don't tell where you're going until the last minute. This is going to mess it up. Our next question comes from Emily, who says 2 words, Myotragus balericus. I probably said that wrong. No matter how much I look into this creature, I can't stop feeling extremely skeptical about the claim that it was cold-blooded. I thought that being a mammal and being warm-blooded automatically went hand in hand, especially considering that it is related to warm-blooded creatures that still live today. Could you help explain why the cold-blooded claim is reasonable? Am I missing something?
Yeah, so just for people who may not be aware, Myotragus balericus is a kind of goat antelope. It is a mammal, but it's a goat antelope that lived on islands in the Mediterranean Sea. It's also known as the mouse goat or the cold-blooded cave goat. Cold-blooded does not mean freeze in blood. It just means that the animal principally gains its body heat from its environment rather than generating the heat itself by its own metabolism. So even though this is the only known cold-blooded mammal, it does appear that it was cold-blooded, which just meant it got most of its body heat from its environment rather than generating that heat itself. The way this apparently happened is so the mouse goat was trapped on a resource-poor island that had no natural predators, and it had to adapt itself to this environment. One of the consequences of that was it acquired a characteristic known as island dwarfism, which is where creatures that are confined to an island tend to get smaller generation by generation until they reach a stable point. In the case of the mouse goat, it was less than 18 inches tall. So it got small so that it wouldn't have to use as many resources. It also adapted to having very little food to eat. And this took the form of developing reptile-like characteristics, such as slow bone growth, because since they don't have fast metabolisms, reptiles grow slower. And in fact, in this case, the mouse goat, even though it's a mammal, it took 12 years to mature to adulthood, as opposed to 9 months for a normal goat. It thus appears to have been cold-blooded in the sense that it didn't generate most of its body heat internally, but absorbed it from the environment. It's the only known mammal to be known presently to have done this, and we'll have a link to more information about it in case you'd like to read more.
The next question comes from Cyprian, who writes, Hi, Jimmy. How old do you think?
It's probably Cyprian, but you're pronouncing it if you really want to say it the Greek way, it would be Kuprian.
Yeah, I probably butchered that. Sorry, Cyprian. How old do you think Jesus was when he was crucified? I've heard you mention several times that you believe Jesus was born in 2 or 3 BC. Mm-hmm. Also, Luke's gospel mentions that Jesus started his public ministry when he was about 30 years old, and John's gospel seems to indicate that Jesus' ministry lasted about 3 years. Mm-hmm. Does this mean that Jesus lived on earth about 35 or 36 years instead of the 33 years that many people think?
Yeah, so I do think Jesus was born in the second half of 3 BC or the first half of 2 BC, and I do think that the crucifixion can be reliably dated to Passover of AD 33, and when you do the math, I would estimate that Jesus would be something like 34 years old, plus or minus a year. One of the things you have to do in performing that calculation is remember there is no year 0. It jumps from 1 BC to 1 to AD 1. And so it's not the same as just taking 2 BC and adding it to AD 33 and getting 35. You have to remove that year because there is no year 0. So I would guess he was about 34 years old, plus or minus a year.
Richard asks, I'd like to know what the Catholic Church's exact teaching is on charging interest on a loan. How much interest is allowed before it's considered usury? In medieval society, it seems to have been viewed as a sin to charge any interest, which is why Jewish people were relegated to money lending. Anyone who has paid back a mortgage learns you pay your mortgage lender back 2 to 3 times the amount you borrowed. That seems like usury to me. A similar case can be made for bonds of all sorts, municipal, state, federal, and corporate. There are also some kinds of usury too. How can a sin become an industry?
Okay, so the idea that taking interest is sinful is intuitive to humans. If you loan me $1,000, it seems natural that I should pay you back $1,000 and not more. This is why many in the ancient world classified all forms of taking interest as sinful. However, this view is based on the idea that the economy is a zero-sum game where for someone to win, someone else must lose. And eventually it was realized that this is not the case. The economy is not zero-sum, and both the borrower and the lender can benefit when interest is taken. One of the benefits, or one of the things that was missing from the ancient calculus, is the recognition that there is a benefit to having money now. So, for example, if I lend you $1,000 so that you can start a business, and you then start a business, you benefit from having that $1,000 now. You couldn't start the business and begin making a living from it if you didn't have the money now. On the other hand, by lending you the money, I'm denying myself the benefit of having the money now. I can't use that money myself for something like starting my own business. So it makes sense once you're making money over and above the $1,000 because you started a business, it makes sense for me to get something in the form of interest to compensate me for denying me the use of my own money in order to help you. So it's reasonable for you to take the $10,000 and start a business and start making your own money and then pay me back a bit more than the original $1,000 to compensate me for denying myself the use of my own money to help you. The church does not have an exact teaching on how much interest is too much. The financial situation is too complex to establish firm rules, and there's usually more than one way to look at a situation and how to evaluate it. Thus far, I would say the best determiner of interest rates seems to be the market mechanism, though many churchmen seem to be uncomfortable with this. When it comes to the situation that you described of paying back your mortgage 2 or 3 times the amount you borrow, I can understand how that would seem like too much interest or usury. And I didn't pay that myself. I saved up my money and paid cash for my house, so I don't have a mortgage. But the flip side of that is I had to pay rent for all those years while I was saving up my money. And so a real estate lender could say, yeah, paying back 2 or 3 times seems like a lot, but you actually get to live in your house for all those years you're paying off the mortgage, rather than having to pay rent while you save money. So it's more fair than it seems. Paying 30 years of rent and paying the price for a house, may come out to be basically the same as paying the price of a house and paying the interest on a 30-year mortgage. In fact, it might even be cheaper than what I did. So there can be different ways of looking at the situation. And the only way to figure them out is to run the numbers, look at your finances, and see what seems reasonable.
Jason asks, still waiting for more follow-up to your Life on Mars groundwork episodes. Until then, what do you think of the claims for artificial structures on Mars? Cydonia, the face, pyramids, tunnels, etc.?
Well, I do plan to do future episodes on not just life, but the possibility of a civilization on Mars and its destruction. I'm open to, but skeptical when it comes to claims about artificial structures on Mars. I think that some of the proposed structures are likely not artificial, but I am open. I've done some reading in this. I've listened to some talks on this, and we'll see what form it eventually takes, but I will be talking about a possible extinct civilization on Mars.
Our next question is another one from Perla, who says, in the episode Speaking with the Dead, there is the case of Tisius, who was using a sort of Ouija board to contact the dead. In that case, the Holy Office replied that in those circumstances these practices were not permissible. Then you explained that the rule was in those circumstances, as in Titius's case, but that they don't apply to other circumstances. My question is, in which circumstances, in your opinion, is it okay to use a sort of Ouija board or equivalent instruments to contact the dead?
Okay, so we talked about this reply from the Holy Office in episode 270. So for those who want to hear about it, you can go to mysterious.fm/270. And Titius wasn't, which is a fictional name that his bishop was using, but Titius wasn't using a Ouija board. He was using automatic write-in. The bishop who asked the question specified that Titius had gone to great lengths to avoid anything that would contradict the faith in his practice, and then he asked, is this okay? Normally, the Holy Office responds to queries like this with one-word answers, either affirmative or negative, when they're asked a question like this. But in this case, it gave a more ambiguous reply that was longer, and it said that what Titius was doing was not okay in these circumstances, which would suggest that there are other circumstances where what Titius was doing might be legitimate. Unfortunately, the Holy Office didn't elaborate on what those other circumstances would be. So, here you're asking my opinion, so I'll tell you. I'm not as focused on the means by which one attempts to communicate with the dead, but I'm more focused on whether you're initiating contact. In Titius's case, he was initiating the contact. He wasn't responding to spirits that had already made contact. And to my mind, that's a more problematic thing to do. However, since 1 John 4 tells us to test the spirits if they manifest, I don't see any reason why you can't respond to a spirit that's already made contact. Like if you're in a house and a ghost shows up, Catholics traditionally have asked questions of the ghost to figure out, what it is and how to help it, if it's a soul from purgatory and things like that. So I don't recommend the use of Ouija boards, but in terms of responding to a spirit, I don't think there's a fundamental problem there. I think the New Testament expects us to respond. Where it gets more dicey is if you're not responding but initiating contact.
Paul asks the following question. Any thoughts on how theistic evolution operates? Perhaps an episode on the mystery of DNA? Each chromosome contains roughly 3 billion pairs of DNA. The probability against ACTG being sequenced randomly, without God, to create working structures is truly mind-blowing.
The essential question is whether theistic evolution involves the direct intervention of God to accomplish certain goals, or whether it depends solely on the laws that God set up in the universe. Advocates of theistic intelligent design make the argument that it must involve direct divine intervention. I've studied the arguments concerning intelligent design a little bit, but I haven't studied them thoroughly in recent years. However, if I can do so, then we will indeed likely have an episode on this topic.
Next question comes from Drew, who writes, Hi, Jimmy and Dom. I've got 2 questions for you. First, in Mark 15:16, Jesus tells the 11 to go into the whole world and proclaim the gospel to every creature. What does Jesus mean by creature? What does the original text tell us?
Well, what Jesus says in Greek is to preach the gospel te passe ktise, which technically does not mean to every creature. It means to all creation. The terms that are used here are in the singular rather than the plural, so all creation, not every creature. However, even supposing that it said to every creature, well, a creature is anything that God has created. Any created being is a creature. However, when we look at a statement, we have to ask what the universe of discourse the author has in mind. And Jesus obviously does not mean for us to go preach the gospel to rocks and snowflakes and carrots and dogs, none of which are language users and none of which dogs have a little capacity for language receptively, but they're not going to understand the gospel if you preach it to them. What he means is for us to preach the gospel to all human beings, to language users that are capable of understanding it.
His other question is, cultures throughout the world have legends and stories of dragons. What could account for the universality of these stories? I hope dragons are on the big list. Thanks.
Dragons are on the big list, and I hope to have an episode on them later this year. And spoiler, I think that one of the things that's responsible for these stories all over the world are the dinosaur bones that people have been finding all over the world through all of human history.
So that's it for all the questions we have time for today, but don't worry. Any questions that we didn't get to will be picked up for our next Patrons episode. So, Jimmy, what further resources do we have for today's show?
I would just point folks to the links that we'll have in the show notes, and that'll do it for today.
Excellent. We hope you've enjoyed this Patrons Question Show. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is only possible because of the generosity of our patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to support Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and have your questions answered on future shows for patrons, go to sqpn.com/give. And again, you can find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/328. So that's it from us. What are your theories about any of the patrons' questions Jimmy answered? Let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @mys_world, in the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or by calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work on this episode. Check out what they do. Go to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. And while you're there, you can help me grow my channel. If you like, comment, and share the video, it tells YouTube that you found it engaging, and so it'll share it with more people. Also, I am, trying to grow my channel, so please subscribe and be sure and hit the bell notification so you always get notified whenever I have a new video. Thank you so much.
So, Jimmy, what are we going to be talking about next time?
The next 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about one of the most famous true crime stories ever, the Zodiac Killer. As always, we're going to be keeping it clinical, but parents should still listen and make decisions for their families. Lots of serial killers have higher body counts than Zodiac, but what he's really famous for is the bizarre literary campaign that he kept up for years and the signs of early criminal sophistication that he displayed also point to him having an earlier undiscovered criminal career. So over time, we're going to be doing a 4-part series on the Zodiac Killer. Part 1, which will be next week, we'll focus on the main crimes that he's famous for. Then part 2, the week after that, will be the bizarre literary career that he had. And then at some point later on, because I don't want to do a Zodiac month, we will look at his earlier undiscovered career in part 3. And then finally, in part 4, we're going to look at the suspects for who may have been the Zodiac Killer. So over the next 2 weeks, we're going to be doing the first 2 parts of the 4 parts, and then we'll take a break and consider some lighter topics.
Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at GradyGroupInc.com. And by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part through the generous support of Aaron Vergeson Electric and Automation, making connections for life for your automation and smart home needs in North and Central Florida at aaronv.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.